Welcome to the United Nations in the time of COVID-19, part of the UN Talk series co-hosted by UNDP Sweden and the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. My name is Kate Sullivan. I'm Strategic Planning and External Relations Manager at the Foundation, and I'll be moderating this discussion. The UN Talk series aims to promote critical reflection and a deeper understanding of the United Nations in Sweden. However, we know that many of you are joining us for this virtual conversation from other parts of the world, and we want you to be very welcome. A couple notes on the technical setup for the webinar. You'll notice that you're muted and that your video is disabled. This is intentional. We know that it can be a bit distracting when people have their audio coming on unexpectedly, so please accept our apologies, but we're going to have to keep it this way. If you have questions real time, I'd like to ask you to look at the bottom of your screen. You'll see you have two different functions there, chat, which is disabled, and Q&A. You can use the Q&A function to submit questions, which will go directly to the organizers, and we'll process those and cover as many as we can. However, know that there are 235 of you and just 3 speakers, so there are limitations to what we can cover today. For those who are not aware, we're recording this webinar to be shared later, so if you're uncomfortable with that, now is an opportunity to get offline. All of us have, to varying degrees, been affected by the novel coronavirus, commonly referred to as COVID-19. Since the first case was detected, there have been over 3.6 million confirmed cases and over 250,000 deaths globally. But the effects of the pandemic extend beyond the immediate health concerns and include a variety of economic, political, and social threats in the medium and long term. States have taken emergency measures to protect their citizens and prevent the spread of the disease, but there's also been a concerted international effort. This seminar will explore how the United Nations is addressing the health, humanitarian, and development impacts of the pandemic, with a focus on how it coordinates and tailors its interventions. COVID-19 also offers us with an opportunity to discuss the role of the UN in global crises more broadly. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Ulrika Moder, who's Assistant Secretary General, Assistant Administrator, and Director of the Bureau of External Relations and Advocacy at UNDP. Importantly, she is also a member of the Advisory Committee on the UN COVID-19 Multi-Partner Trust Fund. Also joining us is Shadin Khalaf, who's a Senior Policy Advisor and Head of the MENA Policy Unit at UNHCR based in Amman, Jordan. And last but not least, we have Mohamed Yahya, who's UNDP's Resident Representative in Nigeria. Ulrika, could you give us a bird's eye view of the UN response to COVID-19? What are the major dimensions of the crisis and how are they being taken into account?
Yes, I'll try to do that very briefly, and then I think it will be interesting to hear from the colleagues also working at regional and country level what it looks like, because of course, the UN, with the leadership of WHO, started to respond to the virus as such before it became a pandemic already when we had the outbreak in China. And UNDP has been working also closely with WHO and colleagues in the system responding since the very beginning. But as you were saying, this is a health crisis. It has become a humanitarian crisis, but it's also a development crisis. And we've also seen colleagues in the system speak about this as a crisis for human rights and democracy. So this tells us it affects the whole of society. And it's not a linear process because many of the countries, they have been affected by the socioeconomic, what we would think perhaps the medium, the long-term impact of the crisis, even before the virus hit the country. And it goes a bit like the disease, forth and back. So it's incredibly important for us to cover this from all different aspects and make use of the whole of the UN development system and beyond, of course, because WHO gives guidance on the health response and we are there to support. So I think Mo will tell you that in Nigeria, UNDP has been supporting with regard to procurement of health material. In other countries, it would be other organizations that has those capabilities. But it's incredibly important that the UN comes together and coordinates under the professional leadership. So the health response, WHO, then we have the humanitarian response, of course, then led by the humanitarian coordination. And now we are also working with the socioeconomic response at medium and also towards the long-term direction, supporting governments how to take care of the long-term effects of this that are already hitting countries so badly. You've seen ILO come up with figures that up to 200 million people will lose their jobs even in the second half of this semester. And we know that more than 60% of the world's population are anyhow in informal sectors working, and many of them, of course, have lost their income. So there we have already the humanitarian crisis. We have the WFP also saying that most likely we will double the number of people who will be in need of assistance, humanitarian assistance for life-saving measures because of not having access to food. So it's a crisis that hits all societies, as always. We can see that inequalities play into this in each and every of the country of the world. I do think that you have this debate also in Sweden and the Nordic countries, that some of the most vulnerable groups are hit the hardest. And that, of course, is the situation also between countries. It's a pandemic. We need to fight it together. There's no other way of finding a solution to this. And I think that the Ethiopian Prime Minister is also the Nobel Prize winner, the Peace Prize winner. He said it early on that this is something that tells us how important it is to work together in multilateral solutions to these kind of global challenges. Otherwise, we may risk of having a boomerang effect. If we don't fight this where it hits the most with vulnerable groups in countries or in other continents, it can also hit back. So here we need to show an act of solidarity, but it's also really the enlightened self-interest that has to speak, and the understanding that these kind of crises, pandemics, climate change, we will not be able to solve them unless we work together. And this is what the UN tries to do. And this is why it's fantastic, 75 years after that the UN was funded in the midst of a crisis when we were fighting a different war, we came together and we built an organization to find these kind of solutions. And hopefully the UN can be part of that network that can find solutions, even to a crisis like this one. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Ulrika. Shaden, now we'd like to turn to you for a glimpse at the regional perspective. In the Middle East, how is the UN working with regional institutions to ensure that there's a coordinated response, and what characterizes its approach to the humanitarian dimensions of the crisis in particular?
Thank you very much, Kate. And I just actually like to thank Ulrika also for setting the stage so nicely in her remarks for what I'm about to highlight, because actually it was a perfect explanation of how the system all does very much need to come together for a consolidated, united and strategic response to this global pandemic. So I'll maybe just start by highlighting that the Middle East and North Africa region hosts 40% of the world's displaced population. So this is a very high proportion. Some would say disproportionate to the situation in the region in terms of resources and context. We all know how decades of conflict have devastated many parts of the region, and how the needs of people on the move have been increasing over the years, which means that the level of fragility was already high to begin with before the onset of the coronavirus, or the arrival of the coronavirus and its devastating impact. So as Ulrika mentioned, we've been looking at the situation from three angles: the global health perspective, the humanitarian component, and of course the longer term socioeconomic angle, which is perhaps, I would think, one of the most challenging components of it. But let's stick first of all to what UNHCR has been doing and how we have been trying to respond collectively with our partners on the ground, together with other UN agencies, and primarily with the governments who are in the lead role, I would say, in responding. So we've been designing our response around 5 main pillars, if I may walk you through them quickly. The first one is to continue to deliver protection and assistance for the persons of concern to UNHCR, refugees and other displaced populations, to the extent possible, given the restrictions that are in place on our own movement and our own access to them. So we have had to adapt and innovate how we reach them, while continuing to ensure that we are accurately and effectively monitoring their situation and reporting on their needs, and ensuring that they have access to the services that they require. So we've done that through ramping up a lot of remote services through hotlines, call centers, And numbers of calls have been really going up through the ceiling because the needs are so big. The second thing that we've been, and of course I should add that the large majority of refugees are in urban environments, they are not in camps, so the needs are mixed with those of national populations. The second point is that we have been advocating for the inclusion of refugees in the national public health responses. And this is core because it would not make sense for the UN or other entities to have parallel structures in order to respond. What we have been doing is encouraging and advocating governments to include refugees in the response mechanisms that they are setting up, and supporting those governments where possible through either support to medical facilities, ICU units, with ambulances, or with the provision of masks to ministries of health, etc. Third thing we've been doing is to prioritize prevention of continued infection. Fourthly, we've been ramping up our communication and our outreach to the communities to make sure that they are empowered to also carry out this continued dissemination and awareness raising within their own groups. And then lastly, what we've been doing is ramping up cash-based assistance to make sure that people continue to have the dignity that they need and to be able to choose how best to support themselves and their families in light of this very pressing socioeconomic crisis. So we cannot have been doing all of this for the past couple of months, let's say, without very strong relationships and partnerships on the ground with local civil society actors, faith-based organizations, private sector and business actors, and many, many others who have been playing an essential role on the front line, and even there before we arrived and are likely to be there after we have, after our operations perhaps are significantly reduced.
Thank you for that so much, Shadin. That provides a good segue, I think, Mo, for us to go to you and talk about what's happening really at the country level. We know that low and middle income countries like Nigeria, for example, and as Shadin mentioned, those affected by conflict are particularly vulnerable right now. So what I'd like to ask you is, what does the UN response look like at country level, but also how is it being tailored to the unique context, using Nigeria perhaps as an example?
Thank you. Here in Nigeria, the UN response has been really remarkable in the sense that we were able to come together in a rapid time to be able to respond. And what do I mean by this? Once the pandemic started and the government put out a plan on how it needs to respond on the health side initially, we were able to put a UN plan that says this is how the UN can support you across the board, because the UN has obviously expertise on the health side led by WHO and UNICEF backstopping it, and then obviously on the socioeconomic side with UNDP in the lead together with others such as FAO and other UN agencies. We have a big presence here of about 19 agencies. So the UN, under the leadership of the resident coordinator, was able to bring together the system and say this is what we can do to support the government. The government accepted that offer immediately, and this is again in this kind of pandemic, the most interesting part is there's a lot of needs across the country. Even a country such as Nigeria with higher, what is considered a middle income country, but it's also a country that has more than 90 million people in extreme poverty. But it is also a country that has a very weak healthcare system and a system that over decades has not been invested in. So yes, it's a middle income country, but the needs are huge and the capacities are weak. So the UN was able to come in quickly to establish one UN offer, as I said, second, a financing mechanism. And pandemics really, it's for me, at least my experience so far has been in situations as such, the concept of multilateralism, or why the UN was set up in the first place, becomes self-evident. There are very little avenues for the government to go around and seek support. Each country in the world is dealing with a similar problem at the same time. This hasn't happened for a long time. So the UN becomes a conduit of government support, both technically and financially. I'll give you an example on procurement. This has been really critical. Suddenly the government found itself with little test kits or not a lot of PPEs, and its ability to go around the world and source this was always going to be limited. So the UN, through what we call core resources, for example, UNDP was able to put $1 million immediately onto the kitty from resources that are flexible that we receive from New York, and able to interact with our offices in China and secure this key needed equipment and bring it back in the country in a period of 2 weeks. So that is what the UN has been able to do, uses global network, support country when it's in a critical need, but also think through in what it can do. Another example I can give of what we've been able to do is we actually have, through WHO expertise, sitting in the, what they call the CDC here, Nigerian Disease Control, and help them think through the modeling, where will this disease go, and help them build up laboratories. For example, when the pandemic started, we had only 5 labs in Nigeria that can of a population of 200 million that can actually test. Today we have 18 in place, and most credit goes to government, of course, for moving very fast, but the UN was with the government all the way supporting setting up those systems. You mentioned the issue of tailoring. One of the things we've been able to do here is when the pandemic started, of course, what was available to government was a plan that was essentially constructed in a different context. For example, lockdowns and shutdowns as a way of what they call non-pharmaceutical approaches to the disease control. Soon, we found out that that is not viable in a country where majority of people live in the informal sector. Many people rely on daily work to eat. You can't really shut them down and lock them down and say you can't go out for a very long time. And especially in Nigeria, where the government budget and fiscal space is limited because of the drop of the oil prices, which meant that the government's ability to respond was also limited. So the UN was able to put together an alternative of how social distancing can be done in a context whereby complete shutdowns over a prolonged period may not be viable. So this is the kind of support we've been doing across the board, financing, technical support, and supporting in terms of thinking where the situation will go in the future.
Thank you, Mo. And actually, before we move to the next segment, just because those examples were very useful, and you mentioned financing, there's a lot of debate right now with obviously a lot of people out of work, what that impact is going to be of national economies shrinking on ODA and support for multilateral organizations. I mean, could any of you comment quickly before we move to the next question about the importance of having reliable, sustainable funding and what that means for your work in particular?
For us, at least in Nigeria, there were 2 processes that really helped. Initially, obviously, there was very little funding for a pandemic that obviously was not known that it was coming. So what has really helped is the flexible funding, at least from the UNDP side, that we get through core resources. Sweden is one of the biggest UNDP supporters, and other countries, there are a few countries that give us flexible funding. Without that flexible funding, we will not have been able to procure those resources, because normally programs are linked or essentially locked down to specific activities. So ability to respond quickly depends on that flexible funding. I can say without a doubt, we will not have been able to double the current ventilator capacity of the country, Nigeria, without having those flexible fundings. Second, lack, and actually leadership, I should say more than lack, was the European Union. The ability of the European Union to come quickly and say, here is 50 million euros, support the government to respond, has also been made a huge difference. But I think flexible funding is the way for the UN to be able to respond to crises and pandemics.
If I may also, Kate,
please do.
I was thinking, and maybe, I mean, Shaden also working with the humanitarian agency, you can really testify that we have a problem in the funding of our global public goods and how we need to safeguard our common future, because it's so short-sighted and many times projectized. And with regard to humanitarian funding that is part of this, the UN has presented a humanitarian appeal. It's less than half funded. I think it's a little bit above 40% now. But the ability for UNHCR and other colleagues really working at the forefront, but also UNDP acting as a development organization in the midst of this, trying to uphold central functions in government so that they can respond, is simply not there. So the investment that countries do, like Sweden and others, I mean, the value of the investment, the effectiveness of the work is so much better if we have that possibility to both act quickly, but also then plan strategically. And that goes both for development and humanitarian agencies.
Shaden, did you have any reflections before we go ahead?
Thank you. Yes, just to fully echo and agree with Ulrika and Mo on the need for this unearmarked, flexible, multi-year funding. The choices that we have to make when our programs are not funded are incredibly difficult, and I really would not wish that upon anyone, to be in that position where you have to decide what gets cut because we don't have the funding that we need at the moment that we do. And having said that, I think it's also very important, and this is the global direction that we are moving in through the Global Compact on Refugees, which many of you are aware of, is the stronger engagement of development actors in humanitarian intervention and in humanitarian work. I think it's an essential way forward, and it is the way that we have to move, given the humanitarian development nexus and the connection also with longer term thinking about prevention of future conflicts and prevention of the tragedies that we witness on a daily basis.
Well, thank you all for that. Very much appreciated. I'd like to reiterate, because we had some participants who are joining us late, that if you use the raise hand feature, we won't be able to come to you. But if you want to submit a question, please do so via the Q&A section at the bottom. Now we're going to move to a dialogue, so there'll be more back and forth. Please don't feel like you need to wait to be given the floor. We'll kick off with quite a broad question. And Ulrika, you touched on this a bit already. Now that we've had the opportunity to hear about COVID-19 and how the UN is responding, how do you perceive the UN's role in addressing global crises more broadly? And as has already been mentioned to some extent, I'd like you to consider in your responses both the context in which the UN was founded and the spirit of global leadership that's enshrined in the Charter, how the UN has responded to past crises, including the extent to which its interventions were successful and why or why not, and also the type of crisis. So the fact that the UN's role and capacity may differ by issue area and between long onset crises like climate change and sudden emergencies like pandemics and famine. So if anyone has any immediate remarks, don't feel like you have to address all of that, but by all means jump in and pass the floor to a colleague whenever you're finished.
It's a huge question, of course, but it's also the world that we live in, and I'm happy to give some few reflections and then pass over. I was saying in the beginning that after the Second World War, which still defines, and we have also geopolitics changing as we speak, and this is very much felt, of course, also in a political organization as the UN. But I think since then it has been said many times by many UN leaders and colleagues that the UN is as good as we make it, and that's why it's also incredibly important that countries, also small countries, because this is fantastic in the UN. I mean, the Nordic countries, a country like Sweden, but also the small island states and other countries can actually be part of that international dialogue and have very much been part of the dialogue, as we have also decided upon both the Paris Agreement to see to that we can hinder the catastrophic scenarios that we will have, and in some countries and places of the world already have because of climate change, but also the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think in 2015, once again, world leaders actually proved that they had an answer, and that answer was fact-based, recognizing the factfulness, as Hans Rosling would have said. And they also invited, as was also the idea from the very beginning of the UN, if you remember, the charter begins with we the peoples. It's not we the governments, it's we the peoples. So it was an open process where there was a strong recognition of science, of civil society, of the private sector, because of course the UN with its limitations, I mean, sometimes when we refer to the leadership of WHO, I saw a comparison now that the budget of WHO, and now also diminished because of the US withdrawal of the funding, even though Gates Foundation came in a bit, is equivalent to medium-sized New York hospital. So sometimes also when we have these expectations of the UN that is ours as citizens and countries of the world, we also need to manage those expectations in relation to the investment that we are making, both politically and financially. But having said that, I think that, as I said in the very beginning, a pandemic like this one proves the need for a rules-based world order for multilateral cooperation. No country, no part of society can actually make it. And it's proven now. It hits us all, poor and rich, and yes, somewhat differently, but it hits us all and it will affect us all. So I think that we need, in the midst of all of this, and this is also what we discuss now as UNDP has taken on the technical leadership of the socioeconomic response, to come back and start to integrate also what we decided upon with the Sustainable Development Goal. The aspects of economic sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability need to be part of that prevention, as Shaden also referred to. Long-term development actors working more hand in hand with humanitarian actors. I mean, at the country level, and the colleagues can testify to this, and many of you who listen who have also been working in international development cooperation, I mean, those we call the target groups or people in the countries, they wouldn't really tell the difference, of course, because in the midst of a conflict, in the midst of a crisis, people have their daily lives and they need to be able to go and get married or get divorced, or they inherit something. And in all of this, we need also the development actors, as we are also operating in countries that are affected by conflict or a crisis like this one, also to uphold the functions, not in order to let everything become a total humanitarian crisis, because then of course it becomes incredibly costly. So I think that the guidance that the world gave on the sustainable development, and once again referring to what we see and what we saw when we followed up on the SDGs last autumn or during the General Assembly, increasing inequalities in many different aspects, and the degradation of our environment and climate change. These are two factors that are defining the future very much. And I certainly see the problem with inequality really as clearly as you can see it, I think, in any society, whether we speak about Sweden or any other country, looking at how this pandemic has actually hit right now. But having said that, it hits us all, and the effects will be disastrous unless we cooperate in countries, but also in between countries. And there is the UN as the network that we need to make use of and revamp. And as civil servants in the UN, we will do our very best to see to that we can coordinate in between the different entities.
Thank you so much, Ulrika. I like that, revisiting we the peoples and what that means. And I think that the point that you've made about increasing inequalities and the need to address those, and the ecological damage and climate change, you see those that concern in global publics being echoed also in the global dialogue that was conducted in connection with UN 75, the survey that's been conducted now. You see that in the early results that citizens around the world echo those concerns and the need for multilateral response. But before we move to the next question, which is even a bit broader, I'd like to hear Mo and Shaden, do you have thoughts or other contributions in terms of what you perceive the UN's role to be? Do you share Ulrika's view? Do you have a different perspective?
From my side, I think what is very interesting, and Ulrika mentioned, is this pandemic also helps us or pushes us to rethink how development happens. I can tell you, at least in the African context, there's been a really big push about the concept of infrastructure investment. We need roads, we need airports, we need railways, and less focus on the human development side, investing in people, investing in resilience. And I think what this pandemic has shown is that roads don't help you too much with sick people. So I think having infrastructure in health and well-being has been as a prerequisite for development, I think is some of the lessons we will take up from here. And one of the things we are pushing and engaging with government here and many other countries is really to bring back the concept of human development. Sometimes we forget that that is the essence of development. You have to start with the people before you start with things. And I think it's a big lesson for most of the developing countries. It has exposed many of the, not only in terms of social and economic pre-existing conditions, really not only about individual and physical part of it that COVID has exposed.
Thank you so much for that. Shaden, what are your reflections?
Yes, I also fully agree with my colleagues. Again, I'd maybe just highlight two additional points that I think are essential for, let's say, the success, quote unquote, of the UN moving forward in this new environment that we are likely to continue to be living in for a while in the multilateral context. I think we really have to take the localization agenda very seriously. I think it has to be the essential building block of all of our operations. I think the more we tailor, the more we refine, the more we fine tune our operations to the very local context everywhere, the more likely we are to be reaching the people who need to be reached and not assuming that blanket solutions can work everywhere. And I think the second point that maybe I would like to raise is the criticality of having a gendered lens in everything that we do. And whether in terms of our own leadership structures and our own, let's say, positions, and Ulrika is a fantastic example of women in senior positions in the UN and the direction that the Secretary General is taking to achieve that. But otherwise also in our programmatic responses. And we've seen this so evidently in the COVID situation, where women are so much highly impacted throughout the world, where we see the rise of gender issues on the ground, but not necessarily making their way up to the policy discussions at the multilateral level. So I think just to highlight those two elements as things to keep our eye on.
Thank you for bringing those in. I'd like to recognize also how many fantastic questions came in from participants when they registered, and many of those questions touched on the intersection between some of these issues, particularly multidimensional poverty, but also looking at some of the rights-based questions and how inequalities are affecting different populations with this pandemic. So you'll notice that the questions are going to become a bit more abstract before we dig into the details again. I promise we'll get back into specifics, but one more big picture question for you. Some people think that COVID-19 is going to catalyze solidarity and a recommitment to multilateralism, which we've talked about a little bit thus far, both because of the interdependence that we're seeing in the positive and the negative sense in this pandemic, but also because there should be an understanding of the mutual benefits that can be achieved through international cooperation. On the other hand, you have those who feel that the urgency of the needs that have been generated by the pandemic and the recession and those that will come are going to cause member states to look inward, accelerating trends in nationalism that we were already starting to see. Proponents of this view worry that regimes that are interested in withdrawing from international commitments and institutions may exploit the crisis in a number of different ways. So both in terms of how you assess the situation on the ground, perhaps a pragmatic view and a visionary view. What do you think about this? What do you think the world will look like after COVID-19, and how does the UN fit into that picture? Please feel free to jump in, whomever wants to start.
I wish we had the answers. I think it's moving so fast. I think the situation really is evolving so rapidly, but at the same time, the building blocks of the international system remain the same. They remain nation states. So I think that will, at least for the immediate term, remain the structure through which we have to continue to operate. And I think what COVID-19 has highlighted is that no country can achieve this, can fight this virus alone. And I think while we have perhaps never been so polarized as we are on many things, we have also never been as interconnected on this one thing. So it is in a way unifying us collectively at the global level. And I think I'm optimistic, I have to admit. I think that we may come out of this as a stronger UN system, realizing perhaps the hard way that we are all complementary in our mandates and in our operations and in our support to the governments and the people that we are designed and built to serve.
Mo, Ulrika, do you have any reflections on this very, very large question?
Yeah, at least from my side, what I see is, at least in the country level here, the solidarity that the UN is able to bring with all its capacity and systems to support a member state. And this for me is the reason why I joined the UN, and is the reason I'm sure many people who have joined or aspire to join the UN, is the idea that we are from different parts of the world, but we're here in this country supporting this society to achieve its aspiration and defeat the pandemic. I mentioned this to you today. We have UN staff who are working in laboratories and at the forefront of this war today is sick. We have a UN staff that we've lost in Nigeria to COVID. So that this is what the UN does. I mean, this is why we were set up, to be at the forefront, to support our member states, especially in times where everybody else is focusing on themselves, other member states. And the UN is the only organization that is all over the place, tasked to support that specific member state to fight this. The second part is what COVID has shown is our shared humanity. It respects no borders. It doesn't respect any class. It doesn't respect a prime minister or a laborer. It affects everybody. And again, is an important reminder of our common shared humanity and how we need to tackle this issue. And to answer your question in terms of how COVID can be defeated, I think COVID can never be defeated from a national perspective. COVID anywhere is COVID everywhere. It will come back to the country that may have done well in their own territory. And I think this is what you recognize in some of the countries that are helping the UN, and especially I want to again mention the European Union and other member states who help the UN, is a realization that this is the time for solidarity. This is a time that we need to work together and overcome this problem. And I think this is something that the UN represents here, and I'm sure it represents everywhere else.
Yeah. Thank you for that. The concept of our shared humanity and solidarity is so important in times of crises. And obviously it's important to have an institution that represents that and that we're all in this together. Ulrika, did you have any thoughts that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I have lots of from this. And I also wanted to thank Shedan for bringing in what we call localization agenda, I mean, to be relevant to people. And I think that this is incredibly important, that the UN is relevant. So it's both an idea and a place where countries come together and negotiate and come to terms with what is needed, but it's also the relevance at country level. And there I think that's the decisions that have been actually taken to be more relevant and to work closer also to civil society, as Shadin described, is incredibly important for the UN. Not because the UN is also a bureaucracy in the midst of all of this. And that's why I also think that we need, as you have looked into also in Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, a different leadership culture that can release also more of innovation, new ways of working, both within, but also with a broad range of partners, as we've decided to do with the both Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement. But I do believe also that, yes, there are these opposite trends of more nationalism and populism that are incredibly concerning. And then, of course, this proves, and we can all testify that we also see this, that we need more of common solutions to these global challenges. But in the middle of this, there are a lot of people who are not really aware of what's happening. So I think that it's incredibly important also that those of you who have concerns, why is it that the UN does not work this way, or what happened here or there, to discuss this and also see how you can also be part of finding these solutions, to be proactive. I mean, the UN will change when people change the UN. And there are many ways of doing this. So there are UN associations in many countries. There are debates. I mean, we have MPs perhaps on the call. So once again, coming back to what I said in the beginning, that with the peoples, I mean, the UN becomes what we make it. And it will not be a perfect organization, but it can certainly improve. And I must say also, as still quite a recent newcomer, having also looked at the UN with a critical eyes, also from a member state being also a big donor to the system, I have been incredibly impressed by the colleagues who have set up agile organizations to respond, not in a perfect way, and it will all be evaluated. I mean, we've seen also the criticisms towards colleagues in WHO and so on. But if we have critical but still constructive discussion, then we can see to that we build the organization even stronger, and that it is also this organization that Shadin referred to that is increasingly also coordinating with a number of stakeholders needed, because we don't have the funding needed to make the change happen. We need to coordinate. The development finance, the climate finance needs to come from other parts of society as well.
Thank you for that. I think this coordination, the solidarity comes through in all aspects. But I think also your point about the optimism and the fact that this is all being evaluated is wonderful to think about. You often see populism as there's a false dichotomy between populism and globalization. You're either for your nation or you're for the world. And one can be a patriot and still recognize that the methodology of cooperation at a global level is very effective at solving certain types of problems. So now I'm going to dive into some more. We're halfway through. We've addressed actually many of the questions that have been proposed by participants thus far. But as mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, there are 235 who registered, 128 participating with us now. Many more questions than we'll be able to get to. What I want to recognize is that this is one of many seminars. So for those participants who haven't had their questions answered at the end, know that we've made note of them and we can follow up on these conversations later in a number of different ways. This next question is quite technical, and Mo, I'd like to direct it to you because I think it relates to your first intervention. Who is consulted in the development agency response plans? And how are those plans anchored and integrated into existing strategies at country level?
So you mean the pandemic response plans at the national level? Is that the question?
Exactly.
So the government obviously has a plan. In the case of Nigeria, it's called a multi-sectorial response plan that looks across the board from what kind of labs do I need, where do I need them, what kind of isolation centers, surveillance, tracking. So it's a full, in Nigeria, it's a 10-point plan. So then what the UN does is say, okay, from the 10-point plan, this is the UN's offer or UN's support to you. And then we take it to government, we consult and they come back and say, okay, this is good, or add this and add that. So once we do that, then, and this takes a couple of days, it's not, so for pandemic, you don't have time to, it's not a normal development planning exercise, it's a crisis response exercise, so you have to do it very quickly. And once that is in place, then it's actually essentially the UN's response to the government plan. And then this is then the issue of the financing comes in. We were able to obviously allocate small resources from our core resources in UNDP and other agencies, and then follow that up with asking our member states to come in. And as related to the previous question, probably it's not the easiest time to ask member states to come in. They have their own crises, they have to deal with their own problems, but those that have been able to come in, and I think have made a huge difference. And for us, the Nordic countries and through the core resources, but also the EU through direct support, the UK government and others have been immense. Also, private sector, I just want to say in the case of Nigeria, it's been unbelievable how private sector entities, both international and local, such as Maersk, the Danish company, shipping company, others such as Dangote Foundation, the richest man in Africa, and others coming on board and supporting the UN plan has been immense and has made a big difference. I'm happy, I know we don't have time, but with a huge list of things that we were able to bring into the country to support the response plan in this country.
Thank you for that. And a follow-up question, you don't have to take it, Mo, someone else could take it, but there have been several questions about the UN development system reforms and what that means at country level in terms of the way that country teams are prepared to address this challenge and other challenges. How does the reforms and kind of where you are in the reform process, how does that play into the response now, or does it play into the response now?
I know I'm speaking too much. I don't know if the others want to come in, but I'm happy to take on the response. I have been here for nearly a year now, and obviously my time in here has corresponded with the UN reform. It's been nearly 1 year since the UN reform. I just want to tell you to the listeners here, the reform has really worked in the case of Nigeria. I can't speak globally. We at UNDP, at least as the representative of UNDP, I was tasked by the RC to play my integrator role. And what does that mean? It means writing the UN One response plan, for example, bringing different components of health, working with the health actors to say, what can we do with health, WHO, UNICEF, but also bringing the non-health sectors, because this is not only, as Ulrika pointed out, it's not only a health crisis, it's also a social-political crisis. So bringing those elements together into a UN plan has been really important, and this is the role the UNDP plays as the integrator. We also manage the basket fund. We do the analytics that looks beyond health. So on our role as an integrator, I think substantive integrator that has worked. The RC and the RC system here has worked too. The RC's leadership has been really important in engaging with government, bringing the UN system behind him to support the government response. So for those who have supported the UN reform, I just want to tell you, so far it's good, and this crisis I think has shown that it's working, and hopefully will continue to work.
Optimistic, really good words to hear that from someone working in country. Shaden, I think I'll turn to you with the next one. This is quite a general question, but there's a lot that fits into this, and it relates to prevention and resilience. What could the UN learn from the experience of COVID-19 to ensure that it's better prepared for the next global crisis? You addressed this a bit before. You talked about the 5 points of the response now, but thinking more broadly about the way that the UN is working, and both what's been working very effectively during this crisis and what challenges you faced in your work. Could you speak to this question about what we can do better, or what we can think about building on or improving for the next crisis?
Sure, thank you very much for that, Kate. I think one thing we can continue to build on, which we have been working on already, but one which will be critical for the way forward, is partnerships. Really building meaningful partnerships across the spectrum, whether it be with other UN agencies, among UN agencies, or with multi-stakeholder actors who, I'm mentioning again, the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Refugee Forum, which took place in December of last year, which was really an opportunity to showcase the important role of these multi-stakeholder actors in responding to and finding solutions for displacement in general. But I think that we in the MENA region have caught on to this, I think, early on, thankfully, and we have been working very intensely with our country operations to make sure that that is happening and happening effectively. I think one of the challenges is, of course, that many of these groups are not familiar with the UN system. They are not exposed to the intricacies and the bureaucracy that Ulrika mentioned earlier, and it is sometimes an obstacle in the way of really bringing them on around the table in the design phase of the responses, not only in the implementation phase. I think for it to really be meaningful partnership, everybody needs to be around the table much earlier on than they perhaps have been to date. So I think that's both a challenge and something, a positive indication to work on.
Thanks very much for that. The next question, and this is a really big one, Ulrika, I think I'll put this to you, but then others can, that's the downside of seniority, the others can respond. This is about prioritization and trade-offs. I'll preface it by reiterating what we've already talked about. The challenges related to multidimensional poverty and shrinking space have been multiplied by the pandemic. With that in mind, how can we focus on development and human rights while fighting an immediate crisis? And how will COVID-19 impact financing and implementation of the 2030 agenda?
Thank you. So if I take the latter first, I think I already touched upon it. I think we have good reasons to be very concerned about the foundation for development finance that still in many countries is ODA. Because we know that many countries calculate ODA in relation to their GNI, and we know, if we look at the European countries today, I think there was a prognostic about decrease by almost 7%, and of course that's incredibly concerning in a time where we know that we will need more investment to build back, as it's said, build back better, and that building back better should really then be inclusive and green, and as Mo said, you know, we need to take this seriously now. If we don't build, and it will not be done in a couple of years' time, but we need to build well-functioning health systems, but also these institutions that then are needed to safeguard also that governments actually respond to citizens and that there is transparency and accountability. So of course the lockdowns is a way to protect, but there is also concern, and our colleagues also focusing on human rights and UNDP is part of that network. We are also in close dialogue with countries with regard to the lockdowns. You've also seen WHO refer to this as not a generic measure, even though many countries have taken it. We've seen postponement of elections and so on. And I think that perhaps what's most telling is that the countries who are able to do the best they can given the different conditions they have, they are countries where you see a lot of trust between citizens and agencies, state agencies, or the government. And this is also something we have experienced also, and you've heard about it in relation to the Ebola response earlier on the past years. So of course, everything that has to do with fundamental human rights, the respect for media, and for media to report, to have a critical debate in each and every society is incredibly important to build that trust. That is the basis of the social contract between the government or other decision makers and people. So we have to look at this, as I was saying in the very beginning, we need to have a holistic response. And this is very much part of the discussion also, you should know, within the UN. We are already discussing this. And that's also why it's so important that we have specialized agencies that can look at these from this angle. And then we have the development actors such as UNDP, where we also have a mandate to work on democratic governance, rule of law, human rights, and so on. And we can, with a close relationship we have with governments, also give that kind of support and guidance. So it's I think already, and also of course in relation to really vulnerable groups such as refugees, it's incredibly important. And we have also from the very beginning looked at discrimination. We have issued a lot of support to platforms where we have been able to communicate to different parts of discriminated groups or minority groups in countries and so on. I want also to mention that actually one of the most common asks from our colleagues in country teams, but also UNDP colleagues, has been to counter disinformation and misinformation. So this is also something that we see increasingly in our society and something that we have seen increasing during this time of crisis. It is a reason of concern. I don't know if I answered the question. But
no,
it's
a huge question, and
yeah.
This was a great start.
But really, those of you who listen, I mean, I think, and some of you, at least those of you who listen in Sweden, and you know my background, and I've been fighting since the civil society days for the importance of ODA. ODA is not, and that, I mean, you can also speak to that from a Nigerian perspective. I mean, it's a tiny part of development finance, but it's very much needed in order to create these networks, especially for the normative work, the value-based work, but also for the new ways of working that can help us to find solutions. So maintaining the multilateral system and funding it is incredibly important onwards. And I think that this is proven now with the pandemic.
Thank you, Ulrika. I'm conscious of time. We have about 5 more minutes. Mo, did you want to talk a little bit about the 2030 agenda in Nigeria and what you see as striking this balance between the immediate needs and the long-term development concerns that you've already commented on a bit? And then Shaden, if you would, I'd love to hear a bit more about the populations that you work with from a rights perspective and a humanitarian questions.
So, okay, thank you. You know, what I tell my colleagues here, even in the office, is, you know, as we respond to COVID, let's not assume that every other problem has gone to vacation. They're taking holidays and they're waiting for COVID to end. It just doesn't work like that. So the issue of poverty, the issue of meeting the SDGs overall, in the case of Nigeria, in the northeastern part of this country, we have an insurgency led by Boko Haram ongoing. There are 1.8 million people in IDP camps, and we've been actually working with UNHCR on how to decongest them to make sure that when the virus is not if, but when, unfortunately, we're able to at least make sure that some form of social distancing could be done. So the work continues virtually as much as possible, but in the Northeast, many of my colleagues as we speak are in the front line and looking at building infrastructure in relates to housing for IDPs who are or those who want to go back to their homes as part of our stabilization offer, which again, Sweden and others support. So those programs are ongoing, but also the government is ongoing with its development agenda. One thing that we'll have to rethink, as I said, is in the case of Nigeria, the current development plan comes to an end this year. And I think with the impact of COVID, we really have to start calculating what priorities should be and how do we ensure that the healthcare aspect, as I mentioned, the issue around resilience and poverty becomes at the top. While we understand the need for infrastructure and other aspects as an engine of development, but prioritizing human development will be a key push that we will be making. As I said, we are continuing to working on other areas that we were here to do, but I think we've had significant reversals. We can't ignore that. Here in Nigeria, in 2 weeks, we project of shutdowns, we project 38.8 million people losing their jobs. The economy is in a recession already. The government's ability to invest in key needs will be limited because of two shocks that Nigeria has faced. One is the global recession by COVID. The second is the collapse of the oil prices, which constitutes 70% of the budget. So there'll be a lot of more work on the development side, but we will be here the long term. And if any country can overcome this problem, is this country with immense talent that across the board. So we are not a lot of work, but we are positive that the SDG agenda will be back in the and at the forefront of the response.
Thanks, Mo. Shaden, do you have some reflections before we go into the wrap up?
Sure, thank you, Kate. I think you wanted me to touch a little bit on the protection challenges, perhaps. So our High Commissioner has been calling for all of us to be extremely vigilant on some of the implications of both COVID and the responses that are being taken to, I should say, the measures that are being taken to respond to COVID, namely border closures, restriction on movement, shutdowns, which are inevitably disproportionately perhaps affecting refugees who are already facing many obstacles along these lines. So I think what we are calling on all governments and partners to do is to ensure to the extent possible that these are temporary measures, that they are in place to address the immediate impact, but that in the longer term, we don't fall into a pattern of permanence of these restrictions, because they can continue to have very severe consequences for refugees and displaced populations. In addition to that, we are, of course, we recognize that governments need to put these measures in place, obviously, but to the extent possible, we are calling for also humanitarian exceptions to make sure that staff can have access to populations of concern in camps and otherwise where possible, because in some instances, those were also limited as initial reactions to the pandemic. So we are moving in a positive direction, thankfully, in most parts of the region, but it's an issue that we continue to watch very closely.
Thanks very much, Shaden, for those closing remarks. I'd like to now, with just a few minutes remaining, thank our speakers for their fantastic interventions and for taking the time out of their busy schedules during this very difficult period to meet and share their expertise. I'd also like to thank the participants who are on the call on behalf of the co-hosts. Thank you for participating and thank you for working with us while we test this new platform. Before you sign off, you'll notice if you look in the chat function now, there is a link. This goes to a feedback survey, which takes about 1 minute to complete in order that we can continue to improve upon this series and take your considerations into account. We'd love to hear how we're doing. So I'll leave the webinar open for the last 2 minutes, and we'd ask that those who are able to, if you could complete that, we'd be very grateful. A round of applause for our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you, Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And keep up the good work.